Ironwood Crossing, Wyoming Territory. The 14th of October, 1885. The wind came down the valley out of the Bighorns that afternoon, with the particular dryness that an old prairie woman would have called the breath before snow, and along the single muddy main street of Ironwood Crossing, the cottonwood leaves rattled across the false front clapboards like a handful of thrown dimes. Mr. Ezra Plummer was sweeping the boards in front of his general store. Mrs. Letitia Croft, the minister's wife, was carrying a basket of late pumpkins from the wagon on the corner of 2nd and Mercer. The sky above was the color of a tin plate that had been scoured too many times. There was a smell on the wind that everybody in Ironwood Crossing knew. There was a smell of iron and of frozen earth that is not yet frozen, and of the kind of cold that does not announce itself but arrives and finds you wherever you happen to be standing. Out at the Goodale farmhouse, half a mile south of the town along the Ironwood Creek Road, that same wind was working at the loose shingles on the south gable, and Eulalie Goodale was on her knees in the front parlor with a wooden bucket and a cake of lye soap and a stiff hog bristle brush, scrubbing the pine floorboards by the fire irons until her knuckles burned. She had scrubbed those boards every Tuesday and every Saturday since she had married Thomas Goodale 4 years ago, last June. She had scrubbed them on the morning of his funeral. She had scrubbed them on the day after, when the blue bottle flies came in through the kitchen window and would not leave the stove. She was scrubbing them now because there was nothing else in the world her hands knew how to do, and her hands had to do something, or her chest was going to stop on her. Thomas had been dead 4 months. The typhoid had taken him in the 2nd week of July. He had come in from the south pasture with a headache on a Wednesday, gone to his bed Thursday morning, and by the following Tuesday at 3:30 in the afternoon, he had stopped breathing in the upper bedroom of his mother's house, with Eulalie holding the cool cloth on his forehead, and his mother sitting in the rocker by the window saying the rosary in a voice that did not sound like prayer, but like accusation. He had been 28 years old. He had been a good man. He had been the only person in the Goodale household who had ever spoken to Eulalie as if she were not a stranger they were obliged to feed. The brown dog Birch was lying in the doorway of the parlor with his big square head on his paws, watching her work. He was 4 years old that autumn. Thomas had brought him home as a puppy in a feed sack the spring before the typhoid, and he had said, "This one's yours, Laylee. He's got a chest like a parson's collar. He'll see you through." Birch had grown into a 40-pound mutt with a wide white blaze across his brown chest and brown eyes that always seemed to be on the edge of asking a question. He went where Eulalie went. He slept where Eulalie slept. He had not eaten properly for a week after Thomas died, and Eulalie had sat on the back step and fed him scraps of fried pork from her own fingers until he started taking food again. The front door opened behind her. Eulalie did not turn. She knew the step. It was Mrs. Honora Goodale, 62 years old that November, in her black wool day dress and her black wool shawl and her plain black bonnet pinned tight as a fist. Mrs. Goodale had been a widow herself for 19 years. She had buried a husband and now a son, and grief in her had gone the way of bad meat. It had not softened. It had cured, and it had cured into something that could keep through any winter and feed nobody. "Get up off the floor, Eulalie," Mrs. Goodale said. Eulalie wiped her brush on the rim of the bucket. "I'm not finished, ma'am." "Get up off the floor." Eulalie sat back on her heels. She kept her hands on the brush. The fire in the parlor grate had burned down to a soft red. The wind outside found a chink in the south window and made the lace curtain breathe in and out. Birch lifted his head from his paws and looked from Eulalie to Mrs. Goodale and back again. "Cornelius is coming home from Cheyenne on the Friday stage," Mrs. Goodale said. Cornelius was Thomas's older brother, a bachelor of 34, who had been working as a railroad clerk in Cheyenne for 6 years. "He is bringing a wife. Her name is Miss Adela Strickland. She is a respectable girl from a good Cheyenne family, and she is to live in this house as Cornelius's wife and as my daughter." Eulalie waited. She had learned in 4 years when Mrs. Goodale was finished and when she was not. "There is not room in this house," Mrs. Goodale said, "for 2 daughters." The fire moved. Birch did not move. Eulalie set the brush down slowly on the rim of the bucket, and she felt, in a place very low in her stomach, the slow turning over of something that had been getting ready to turn over for weeks. "You want me to leave," she said. She said it flat, without question, the way you read out a list of dry goods. "I want you out of this house by Thursday morning, Eulalie. Cornelius and Miss Strickland will be on the Friday stage. The room you and Thomas had will be theirs. You may take your trunk and your dog and what is in your trunk, and you may go where you like. I will write you a character if you ask for one." "And the farm," Eulalie said. "The farm is mine. It was always mine. Thomas was my son. The deeds were never put in his name. You knew that when you married him." "I knew that, ma'am." "Then you know there is no place here for you." Eulalie was looking at the floorboards. There was a knot in the 3rd board from the hearth, a knot the size of a silver dollar that Thomas used to tap with the toe of his boot whenever he came in from the barn. She had not ever told him that she watched him do it. She had not told anybody. It was a small thing she had kept for herself. "It is the 14th of October, Mrs. Goodale," she said. "I know what day it is. First snow could be Wednesday. It could be. Where am I to go?" Mrs. Goodale's pinched mouth worked once. "That is not my concern, Eulalie. I have given you 4 years of room and board. I have given you a roof. I have given you a place at my table even when my son was in the ground. There is nothing further owed." Eulalie nodded once. She was not crying. She had used up her crying in July. She stood up off the floor in a way that her knees did not like, and she walked past Mrs. Goodale and into the small room at the back of the house that had been hers and Thomas's. And she shut the door, and she put her back against the door, and she looked at the trunk at the foot of the bed and said, very quietly, to the trunk, "Well then." Birch came under the door and put his head against her knee. She did not pack much. There was not much to pack. She took the blue-gray wool dress she was wearing and one other much like it, the cream linen apron Thomas's grandmother had given her on her wedding day, 2 changes of underclothes, the heavy charcoal shawl, her dark wool stockings, her one good cotton chemise for sleeping, a thin bone comb, a tin of sulfur matches, a stub of beeswax candle, a half-pound of coffee in an oilcloth twist, a packet of needles, a spool of black thread, the little folding knife Thomas had carried since boyhood, his Bible with the soft black leather cover that had gone gray at the corners, the tintype photograph of him in his Sunday coat from the Cheyenne photographer the summer they were married, a small cast-iron skillet, a tin cup, a tin plate, a horn spoon, the hand pick from the kitchen garden tools that she had used all season for breaking the clay around the rhubarb roots, the small, short-handled axe she had used for kindling, a coil of hemp rope, and a folded square of waxed canvas she had laid by from the haying. The waxed canvas was 8 feet by 6. It was the largest single piece of cloth she owned in the world. She rolled the wool things and the canvas around the iron things and tied the bundle with the rope. The bundle came up to her hip when she set it on its end. It was heavier than she had thought it would be. It was lighter than Thomas had been in the bed. She put on her boots. She put on the shawl. She put the Bible inside the apron pocket against her hip where she could feel it. She tied the dog's lead to her wrist. She came back through the parlor with the bundle on her shoulder and Birch at her heel. And Mrs. Goodale was standing by the front door with her arms crossed and her hard, pale blue eyes set somewhere above Eulalie's bonnet. "There's a stage to Casper on Saturday," Mrs. Goodale said. "Mr. Plummer holds the tickets." "I have no money for a stage, ma'am." "Then walk, girl. The Lord will provide for the deserving." Eulalie stopped. She turned her head and looked at Mrs. Goodale full in the face for what was, she realized, the first time in 4 years. The mother-in-law's face was the color of skimmed milk that had stood too long on a sill. There was no hate in it. There was no anything in it. It was a face that had decided very long ago that the world owed it more than the world was ever going to pay, and had set itself accordingly. "He used to tap that knot in the third board with his boot," Eulalie said quietly. "Every time he came in from the barn. Every time." Mrs. Goodale's eyes did not change. "You never noticed," Eulalie said. "I just thought you should know." She stepped out onto the porch. The wind came up off the prairie and took the loose hair at her temples. The dog came out behind her and stood at her left knee. Mrs. Goodale shut the front door with both hands. Eulalie heard the iron bolt slide inside. And here is the first turning of her, the first thing the witness on the road would later swear to. She did not weep on the porch. She did not bend her face into her hands. She bent down, slow, deliberate, bracing a knee against the bundle. And she picked up the leather lead that had fallen at her feet when she set the bundle down, and she wound it once around her wrist, and she gave it a soft tug against the dog's collar, and she said, "Birch, come on now, walk on." And she walked off the porch, down the 3 pine steps, across the dooryard, with its early frost crusting the trodden grass, through the slack gate, and out onto the muddy Ironwood Creek road. And she did not look back at the house. Not once. Not at the window. Not at the chimney. She walked south, down the road she had come up 4 years before in a wedding wagon, with a 40-pound brown dog at her left knee and a single canvas-wrapped bundle on her right shoulder, and her eyes set on the soft graying line of the horizon where the road went over the first rise. 100 yards down the road, where the cottonwoods bent over the track and the light went for a moment to dusk under the leaves, Deputy Gideon Raysmith was sitting his bay gelding at the side of the road. He had been on his way back into Ironwood Crossing from a homestead claim out past Lone Tree, and he had reined in at the bend when he saw the front door of the Goodale place open and the small bonneted figure come down the steps with the bundle. He had watched the whole of it from 40 yards. He was 41 years old that autumn. He had been a peace officer in Wyoming Territory for 11 years. He had seen a great many evictions. He had learned, over those 11 years, which evictions a peace officer can interrupt and which evictions the law has no business in. A daughter-in-law and a deedless farm fell into the second category. He sat the bay and he watched, and his kind gray eyes did not change, because his eyes had learned not to look too directly at anything in 11 years of service in this country. He saw her come to the gate. He saw the dog. He saw her not look back. He touched his hat brim once, very small, in case she looked up the road, but she did not look up the road. She turned south. She began to walk. Deputy Raysmith waited until she was over the first rise and out of sight. Then he turned his bay north and rode the half-mile back into Ironwood Crossing. He did not stop at the Goodale Gate. He did not call out. He did not ride after her. He did, however, that night, in the small back room of the deputy's office above Mr. Plummer's general store, by the light of a single tallow candle, take down the leather-bound journal in which he was required by territorial law to record the day's notable events, and he wrote in it one line in the same careful hand. He wrote everything, and that line was this: October 14th, Goodale widow turned out by mother-in-law, walking south with a dog, no interv. He underlined the no interv. Then he closed the journal, blew out the candle, and lay down on the cot in his shirt and his trousers, and did not sleep until almost 2 in the morning. That was the first turning of Deputy Gideon Raysmith, though he did not know it yet, and would not know it for 147 days. Eulalie walked south on the Ironwood Creek Road for 4 miles. The bundle cut a line across her right shoulder that she would feel for a week. The wind was at her back, which was a small mercy and also not a mercy, because the wind at your back in October on the high prairie of Wyoming Territory is the wind that is bringing the snow. The dog walked at her left knee. He did not pull on the lead. He did not whine. Once, when a jackrabbit broke from the sage at the edge of the road, he turned his head and watched it go, and turned his head back to her and walked on. She did not have a plan. That was the thing she would tell herself. Later, in the long nights, when she was trying to understand what had happened to her. She did not have a plan when she came down off the Goodale porch. She had only the shape of a plan, and the shape of the plan was south, and the shape of the plan was the creek, and the shape of the plan was that she remembered something Thomas had told her in their first summer together, riding down to the creek to fish for cutthroat one Sunday afternoon. There's a limestone cliff about 4 miles down Laley, north-facing, 60 foot up. There's a prospector's camp the old-timers made in the 70s. They left a stove. Pa used to take us boys down there for the trout. She had nodded at the time and not thought of it again. It came back to her now the way the smell of bread comes into a kitchen when you are not expecting bread. She walked. The afternoon went. The sun, what there was of it behind the tin plate sky, sank toward the west. Birch's tongue came out and went back in. Twice Eulalie set the bundle down at the side of the road and sat on it for 5 minutes and did not let herself think. She came up over the long rise where the road dipped down toward the creek. Below her, the cottonwoods marked the line of Ironwood Creek in a soft yellowing band. Beyond the creek, on the south bank, a wall of pale stone rose up out of the prairie like a turned page. It was the color of cream that has stood overnight. It was 60 feet high. It faced north. The afternoon light, what was left of it, came in low across the prairie and fell on the cliff face, and the cliff face caught it and held it, and the shadow of every old water cut and every old swallow hole stood out clean. She stopped on the rise. The dog stopped at her knee. He looked at the cliff. He looked up at her face. "Birch," she said, and her voice was not steady. "I think we have come to it." She went down off the road and across the meadow and across the creek at the shallow bar where the cottonwoods grew. The water was 3 inches deep over yellow gravel, and so cold it bit her ankles through her stockings. The dog swam the deep place at the bend and shook himself on the south bank and sent a small rainbow of drops into the low sun. She climbed the south bank and walked along the foot of the cliff for 100 yards, and at the place where the cliff face fell back into a soft inward curve, she stopped, and she set down the bundle, and she put her hand against the limestone, and she said, "Half to the rock and half to the dog, Lord." It was an alcove. The cliff face here had weathered back over the centuries into a half room of soft pale stone, 12 feet wide at the mouth, 8 feet deep, and tall enough at the back that she could stand without bending her bonnet. The floor was dry sand and pebble. The roof was a single curving sheet of limestone. Above the alcove, running up the cliff face for the full 60 feet, was a vertical fissure no wider than her open hand, dark inside, smelling faintly of old sage smoke. A natural chimney. And in the back of the alcove, set against the rear wall on a flat course of stones some prospector had laid in 1872, was a small black cast-iron box stove, a four-legged Acme No. 2 with a square-hinged firebox door and a 4-inch flue collar in the top. The flue itself was gone, long ago rusted away or carried off by some passing teamster, but the body of the stove was sound. There was a swallow's nest in the firebox. A piece of yellowed newspaper from the 70s was stuffed under one leg as a shim. The stove's iron had gone the color of a horseshoe left out 3 winters. It was still standing on its 4 legs. It had been standing on its 4 legs for 13 years. Eulalie sat down on the sand beside the stove. She put her hand on the cold iron. She could feel, very faint under her palm, the texture of the foundry mark cast into the side. AC Enemy No. 2, St. Louis, 1869. Birch came in past her and circled the alcove twice, sniffed the swallow's nest, sniffed the rear wall, and lay down on the sand with his chin on his front paws and let out a long breath that ended in a small whine. She sat with her hand on the stove until the light went out of the cliff face. Then she said, aloud, to the dog, to the stove, to whatever prospector in 1872 had left an Acme No. 2 and a swallow's nest behind him for an evicted widow to find 13 years later. Thank you, thank you, thank you. If this story is finding you tonight, take a moment to press the like button below. It helps these frontier stories find the readers who need them. That first night she slept, rolled in the waxed canvas with the dog against her back, on the dry sand at the base of the alcove, with the bundle for a pillow and Thomas's Bible inside her apron against her hip. The temperature went down past freezing in the small hours. She woke once, shaking, and Birch climbed half across her, and she got her hand inside his thick brown coat and held the warmth of his ribs against her chest until she slept again. In the morning there was a thin skin of ice on the creek where it bent against the south bank, and her breath went out of her mouth in a white plume, and she stood up out of the canvas and looked at the alcove in the gray morning light, and she thought, very clear, the way a person thinks when sleep has burned the foolishness out of them. I'm going to live in this place. I'm going to live in this place through the winter. There is a stove. There is a chimney. There is a roof of 60 feet of stone over my head. I have a handpick and a small axe and a dog and 4 months of cold ahead of me. I am going to live. That was the morning of the 15th of October, 1885. She made a list in her head as she stood there in the cold. She made it the way her own mother had taught her to make lists, out loud, with the fingers, because a list you could not count off on your fingers was not a list. It was a wish. Water, fire, food, walls, bed, door, 6 fingers, 6 things to live. Water she had. The creek was 40 paces away. Fire she had the beginning of. The stove was here, and the alcove was full of dry driftwood from a long-ago flood, and there was deadfall cottonwood and willow along the creek for a mile in either direction. Food, she had nothing. She had a 1/4 pound of coffee and a horn spoon. She would have to think hard about food. Walls. The alcove was open at the front, 12 feet across. She would have to close it. With what, she did not yet know. Bed. The sand was dry, but it was sand. She would need straw, or grass, or hide. Door. The door would be the last thing. The door was a luxury. She took the small, short-handled axe out of the bundle. She took the handpick. She walked to the creek and washed her hands and her face in water, so cold it made her teeth feel as if they had been dipped in vinegar. She drank from her cupped palm. She came back to the alcove. Birch sat at the mouth and watched her work. She started with the fire. She cleared the swallow's nest out of the firebox into a small pile in the sand, and she said softly, "Sorry, friends," to the absent swallows, who would not have come back to that nest until April, anyway. She pulled the rusted shim of 1870s newspaper out from under the stove leg, and she unfolded a corner of it just to see, and she saw, in pale brown print, so old it had gone the color of weak tea, the words St. Louis Daily Globe, June 18th, 1872. Grant addresses veterans, and she folded it again very carefully because old paper was now a thing she would burn, and she put it inside the firebox. She gathered a double handful of the driest driftwood from the alcove floor, silvered cottonwood twigs, a piece of split willow, 3 knots of pine that some long-ago flood had carried down out of the foothills. And she built a small teepee in the firebox over the newspaper, and she struck one of her sulfur matches, and the newspaper caught, and the willow caught, and the pine knots caught, and the body of the Acme, number 2, after 13 years standing cold in a limestone alcove, took its first heat since the spring of 1872 and began to tick, very small, like a clock starting up. She sat on the sand and watched it. Birch lay against her hip. The smoke went up the firebox into the broken collar where the flue had been, and out into the alcove, and she had a moment of fear that the smoke would only fill the alcove and choke her. But the smoke, finding the cold air against the limestone roof, drew up along the curve of the roof to the fissure at the back, and the fissure took it and pulled it and lifted it, and a thin gray ribbon of smoke went up the inside of the cliff and out into the October sky 60 feet above her head. She watched it go. She put her hand against the stove and felt the small, living warmth. She said, "Birch, we have a chimney." Birch put his chin on her knee. She worked 16 days on the front wall. She did not know, at the start, that she had 16 days. She thought she had perhaps 3. The first snow came on the 18th of October, and it was only a finger's thickness of dust that melted by noon. And the second snow came on the 22nd, and that one stayed in the shade of the cottonwoods for 2 days. And the real snow, the snow that meant the country had turned, did not come until the night of the 30th. 16 days. She used every hour of light and 4 hours of every night. For the wall, she used what was at the cliff. She quarried slabs of soft limestone from a fallen scree at the east end of the cliff with the hand pick, slabs the size of a Bible and slabs the size of a dinner plate, and she carried them in her apron, 2 and 3 at a time, the 400 paces back to the alcove, and she stacked them dry against the open mouth of the alcove. She mixed mud and sand and dry buffalo grass. There was a wallow half a mile up the creek where the bison had not been since the late 70s, but where their old grass and their old dust still lay thick. And she chinked between the limestone slabs with the mud the way her grandfather, a Pennsylvania stonemason, had chinked between the field stones of his root cellar when she was a child of 6 and stood on the cellar steps watching him. She left a doorway 4 feet wide and 5 feet tall in the center of the wall, and she left a window the size of a pie plate to the right of the door at her own eye level. And she set into the window a piece of clear bottle glass from a broken whiskey bottle she found half buried in the sand at the back of the alcove, where some 1872 prospector had pitched it. And she chinked the bottle glass round with mud, and the morning sun, when it came in past the cottonwoods on the 17th of October, came through that small green-tinted glass and put a small green coin of light on the sand floor of her cave. She built a sleeping shelf 2 feet off the floor along the west wall, 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, of the soft limestone, and she filled it with cut prairie grass and willow withies, and the cottonwood leaves she raked up out of the bend of the creek with her bare hands, and over the grass she laid the waxed canvas, and over the waxed canvas she laid the heavy charcoal shawl, and that was her bed, and Birch's bed at her feet. She built a hearth shelf at her own hip height to the right of the stove, of 3 flat slabs, and on it she set the iron skillet, and the tin cup, and the tin plate, and the horn spoon. She built a second shelf above the first for the coffee and oilcloth, and the matches in their tin, and the spool of black thread, and the needles. She drove an iron stake into a soft seam of the limestone wall above the stove, and she hung the small, short-handled axe from it. She built a chimney for the stove out of more flat limestone slabs and the same mud and grass chinking, leading from the 4-inch broken collar of the firebox up the back wall of the alcove and into the natural fissure. And she lined the inside of the chimney with mud only, no grass, because she knew from her grandfather that grass in a chimney is a fire waiting to happen. The chimney took her 4 full days. When she was done, she fired the stove a 3rd time with a careful small load of dry willow, and the smoke went straight up the new chimney and into the fissure, and the cliff swallowed the smoke whole, and only at the lip of the cliff, 60 feet above her head, did the smoke surface again as a thin gray thread against the white October sky. She built a door last. She had no plank lumber. She had no nails. She had a small axe, a creek full of dead cottonwood, and a coil of hemp rope. She felled 3 young cottonwoods at the bend, each as thick as her wrist, and she split them lengthways with the axe and the limestone slabs as wedges, and she lashed them with the hemp rope, and she hung the door from 2 iron pins she set into the limestone with mud and her hand pick. The door was rough. The door was heavy. The door swung inward, and it fit the doorway with a finger's gap on every side. And on the inside of the door, she fixed an iron hook that dropped into a stone-cut socket, and that was her bolt. The day she finished the door, the 29th of October, the eve of the storm that nobody yet knew was coming, she went outside in the late afternoon and stood at the foot of the cliff and looked up at her own work. The wall came up against the alcove like a piece of the cliff itself. The chimney smoke came out of the fissure, thin and gray. The door was shut. The dog was inside. The window was a small green coin of glass to the right of the door. There was nothing about the front of the alcove, from 100 yards out, that did not look like a piece of limestone cliff that had been there since the country was Spanish. She had been alone for 15 days. That night, with the door bolted and the stove ticking, Eulalie sat by the small orange light of the firebox, and she opened the bundle for a thing she had not yet looked at since the parlor, and she took out Thomas's tintype in its tin frame, and she set it on the hearth shelf where she could see it from the bed, and she said to it, there you are, there you are." Birch lay against the bed shelf with his chin on the canvas. The fire ticked. The wind, which had been steady from the north all day, fell off after midnight. Eulalie slept 4 straight hours for the first time since the funeral. It was during the building, on the 24th of October, in the long, cold afternoon when she was clearing the rear of the alcove, of the last of the prospector's leavings, that she found the lithograph. The Acme No. 2, when she pulled it out from the rear wall to lay the chimney behind it, slid easier than she had expected on the soft sand floor, and behind the 4 iron legs of the stove, pushed flat against the back wall on its face, with its paper backing brown and crumbling, was a small framed lithograph the size of a postcard. She picked it up. The wooden frame was cracked at one corner. The paper backing came away in her fingers. The glass was sound. She turned the frame over. It was a printed lithograph of a small boy of perhaps 7 years old, in a black sailor jacket with white piping, sitting very serious on a horsehair settee, with his hands folded on his lap, and his hair brushed flat to his scalp with what was plainly his mother's spit. The lithograph had been done by a Cheyenne studio. The studio's name was printed in fine letters along the bottom edge: Strickland and Grove, Cheyenne, W.Y., 1864. And underneath the boy's small black boots, written in faded ink in a careful schoolmistress hand, was the name Thomas Reuel Goodale, age 7 years. Eulalie sat down on the sand. She sat down hard. The frame was in her hands. The boy in the lithograph was looking at her. He was looking at her with the same level gray eyes Thomas had looked at her with from the bed in July. He was 7 years old. He had not yet been told that the world was a hard place. He had not yet been told that he would die at 28 of typhoid in the upper bedroom of his mother's house. He was sitting on a settee in 1864 with his hands folded. How the lithograph had come to be in this prospector's camp 4 miles south of Ironwood Crossing, behind a stove that had stood unused for 13 years, Eulalie would never know. She would think about it for the rest of her life. She would think that perhaps Mrs. Goodale, in the 70s, had sent the lithograph as a gift to a brother prospecting on the creek, and the brother had not wanted it and had pitched it behind the stove. She would think that perhaps some traveler had stolen it from the Goodale parlor on a passing through and had pitched it here when he was sober. She would never know. The not knowing was, in the end, part of the gift. She did not move from the sand for an hour. The candle stub she lit and set in the iron stove door went down a ½ inch and went out, and she lit a second one. Birch lay against her hip. The light through the bottle glass window faded, and the alcove went to dusk. After an hour, she did the second turning of her, the thing she would not tell anyone about until she was 62 years old, and her own granddaughter asked her where she had been the autumn of '85, and she would tell the granddaughter, and only the granddaughter, in a kitchen in Casper in 1922, the year before she died. She took Thomas's Bible out of the apron pocket. She turned it over. She opened the back board where the soft black leather had separated at the spine, and on the inside of the back cover, in pencil, in her own careful hand, she wrote one sentence. The sentence was, "I did not know you when you were 7, and I am sorry." She closed the Bible. She put it back inside the apron pocket. She put the lithograph on the hearth shelf next to the tintype. She blew out the candle. She lay down on the bed shelf in the dark with her face against the canvas, and the dog climbed up against her back, and she slept. Food was the hard problem, and food was the next problem. She had gone 4 full days on the coffee and what she could forage. Choke cherries dried on the stem at the edge of the meadow, the last of the rose hips, the 2 pounds of ground cornmeal Mr. Plummer had pressed into her hand without a word when she had walked up the back alley behind his store on the 17th and asked, "Mr. Plummer, I have no money. I have a back to scrub a floor with. Will you trade?" Mr. Ezra Plummer was 68. His wife had died of the cholera in 79. He had looked at Eulalie a long time and said, "You scrub my back room out, Mrs. Goodale, and I will see what I can find on a shelf for you." She had scrubbed his back room for 3 hours. She had gone away with 2 pounds of cornmeal, a ½ pound of bacon, ends in brown paper, a square of brown sugar the size of a thumb, and Mr. Plummer's promise that he would say nothing to anybody about where she had gone. "Mrs. Goodale, ma'am," he had said at the back door, "if you do not mind my asking it, where are you going?" "South, Mr. Plummer." "How far south?" "Far enough, sir." He had nodded. He had not asked again. He had said, "If you come back of a Tuesday afternoon, I have a back room that wants scrubbing every Tuesday afternoon, and there is always a ½ pound of bacon ends a needing of a home." That had been her food for the first 2 weeks. Cornmeal mush in the iron skillet of a morning, with a smear of bacon grease and a sprinkle of brown sugar. Boiled choke cherries. A handful of rose hips chewed walking. On the 23rd of October, she had gone with the small, short-handled axe up the creek, a mile to a place where she had seen a yellow-bellied marmot the day before, and she had set a deadfall of 3 flat limestones over a steak and a piece of bacon rind, and the next morning she had a fat marmot the size of a small house cat, and she had skinned it with Thomas's folding knife and broken its haunches into the iron skillet with a cup of melted snow and a little salt she had begged from Mr. Plummer. And she and Birch had eaten marmot stew for 3 days. The marmot's hide she scraped on a flat limestone with the back of the knife and pegged out on the south wall to dry, and on the 4th day she sewed it with sinew she had pulled out of the marmot's own back legs into a pair of mitten shells to go over her cotton mittens. The mittens were not handsome. They smelled of marmot for 3 weeks. They kept her hands warm. By the 28th of October, she had set 6 deadfalls along the creek and was running a line of 3 willow snares along the rabbit runs in the cottonwood thicket, and she was pulling a rabbit a day on average, and a marmot every 3rd day, and a brace of small gray juncos once that the snares took unexpectedly when they went for a snare-baited piece of corn. She had hung a drying rack of rope-lashed willow withies along the back wall of the alcove, and on it hung strips of marmot meat and rabbit meat smoking slowly in the heat that came off the back of the Acme No. 2, and the meat went hard as boot leather and dark as old walnut, and would, she calculated, keep through January. She had also, walking the bottom of the cliff one cold, bright afternoon, found a thicket of bulberry bushes, whose fruit had frosted but not fallen, and she had picked 4 pounds of the small, bitter red berries into her apron and boiled them down on the stove with the last of her brown sugar into a thick, dark jam she put up in the empty bacon rind paper. And the jam was so sour it made her eyes water. But a teaspoon of it in a tin cup of hot water was a winter tonic that had kept her grandfather alive in 3 Pennsylvania winters in the 40s. By the night of the 29th, the night she finished the door, she had on her shelves 11 strips of dried meat, a small clay pot of bullberry conserve, a half cup of cornmeal, 3 small rounds of marmot tallow she had rendered into a tin, the last of the coffee, a stub of bacon, a little salt, a little brown sugar, and the certainty that, if the snow held off another week, she could trap 2 more marmots and set up a brush blind on the creek and try for a buck mule deer with the small axe and her wits, and if she got a deer, she could live to April. She did not get a deer. The snow did not hold off another week. It came on the night of the 30th of October, 1885, and it came in the way Wyoming Territory had been doing for 10,000 years and had not yet stopped doing, which was to say without any warning at all. There had been a soft south wind in the afternoon, almost mild, the kind of wind that makes a homesteader say, "Well, perhaps not yet." And then at sundown, the wind had turned. It had come around in the space of 40 minutes from south-southwest to north-northeast, and the temperature on the porch thermometer at Mr. Plummer's general store had gone from 41 degrees Fahrenheit at 5 o'clock to 19 degrees at 7 o'clock, and at 7:30, the first hard pellets of snow had hit the false front clapboards of Ironwood Crossing in a sound like flung gravel. By 9, the snow was sideways. By 11, you could not see the church across the street from the deputy's office window. By midnight, the wind was steady at 60 miles an hour out of the north, and any creature still on the open prairie that night was a creature that was going to die. At the cliff, Eulalie heard the wind change at 5 minutes after 6. She was sitting at her hearth shelf, eating a tin plate of marmot and rabbit with the last of the cornmeal as a thickening, and Birch was lying against the door, and the door suddenly gave out a single deep groan as the south wind that had been pressing against it changed sides and began to pull at it from the north. The pull lasted 3 seconds and stopped. Eulalie set the tin plate down. She walked to the door. She put her hand against the cottonwood planks. She felt the cold come through. "Birch," she said, "it's here." She bolted the door. She fed the stove with 3 pieces of split pine. She closed the firebox. She drew the heavy charcoal shawl tight around her shoulders. She took down the lithograph and the tintype from the hearth shelf and set them on the bed shelf where the heat would find them. She sat on the bed shelf with her back against the limestone wall and her arms around the dog, and she listened. The wind came up the creek bottom at 8 o'clock and hit the cliff face and split. Half of it climbed the cliff and went over the lip into the prairie sky. The other half curled down along the south bank, found the open mouth of the alcove behind its limestone wall, found the door, found nothing it could move, and went on. It came back at 8:15 from the other direction. It came back at 5:30. By 9, the wind was a steady deep-chest roar against the cliff like the inside of a freight train, and the limestone wall did not move, and the door did not move, and the chimney drew clean and steady because the wind across the lip of the cliff sucked the smoke straight out of the fissure as if a man with a pair of bellows were standing up there, pulling. The temperature inside the alcove, with a careful fire in the Acme No. 2 and a shut door and a sand floor and a sleeping shelf piled with prairie grass, and two bodies pressed together on the canvas, held at 56 degrees Fahrenheit, through the worst of it. Eulalie could see her breath at the door. She could not see her breath at the bed. She slept in fits. The wind woke her at 1. The wind woke her at 3. Each time she got up and fed the stove a careful piece of pine, and lay down again and put her hand on the dog's chest and felt the slow, steady motion of him breathing. The dog did not wake. The dog had decided, at some point in the first hour, that the wind was a problem of the upper world, and that the upper world was not their problem any longer. He slept the sleep of an animal that has come into a den. In the morning of the 31st of October, when the gray light came in through the bottle glass window, the wind had fallen to a steady 20 miles an hour, and the snow was still coming. Eulalie unbolted the door an inch and looked out, and the prairie south of the cliff was a smooth white sea. The cottonwoods at the creek were bent in long, elegant curves like old men praying. The creek itself was gone. The snow had drifted 12 feet deep along the south bank, and the creek was buried. The drift had come up against her front wall to the height of her shoulder and stopped there because the wall was sheltered by the alcove's overhanging lip. She shut the door. She bolted it. She went back to the stove. She fed it a careful piece of pine. She put the iron skillet on the lid with 2 strips of dried marmot and a little snow for water, and she sat on the bed shelf and ate her breakfast in the warm yellow light of the firebox. And she said, half to herself and half to the dog, "Well, we are still here." The storm went on for 3 days. It went on through Halloween, which Eulalie had forgotten was Halloween, and through All Saints' Day, which she remembered only because Thomas's Bible, when she opened it that morning to read a little, fell open at the page where Thomas had penciled in the margin years ago, "All Saints, pray for the dead." She read the page. She closed the Bible. She fed the stove. The storm did not let up until the dawn of the 3rd of November. Snow lay 4 feet deep on the level prairie south of Ironwood Crossing, and 12 feet deep in the lee of every fence line and barn and cottonwood grove and limestone cliff in Wyoming Territory. In Ironwood Crossing, the storm did its work. The Goodale farmhouse, half a mile south of the town along the Ironwood Creek Road, was a 2-story clapboard house with a single brick chimney on the south gable and a wood shingle roof that had wanted reshingling for 2 summers. The chimney drew indifferently in a north wind. The south gable shingles were loose. Mrs. Honora Goodale and her son Cornelius and Cornelius's new wife, Miss Adela Strickland, had been 3 days in the house together by the time the storm came on, and the 3 of them did not speak the same language even on a calm afternoon. Cornelius was a railroad clerk. He did not know how to bank a stove. He did not know how to cut wood. Miss Adela Strickland was 22. She was the daughter of a Cheyenne dry goods merchant. She had never split a stick of kindling in her life, and her trousseau, when she had unpacked it on the Friday afternoon of her arrival, had contained no garment heavier than a worsted traveling cape. Mrs. Goodale had laid by, for the winter, 2 ricks of cottonwood that Thomas had cut in June and a half rick of pine she had bought from a passing teamster in September. It was not enough wood for 3 people in a drafty clapboard house with a south gable and a Wyoming north wind. On the night of the 30th, when the wind turned, Cornelius went out to the woodshed at 7:30 and came back inside at 7:45 with his face white and said, "Mother, we have a problem." "What is the problem, Cornelius?" "There is half a rick of pine and a third of a rick of cottonwood, and the stove eats a stick every 20 minutes. Mrs. Goodale's pinched mouth went tight. Then we will eat a stick every 40 minutes. At 40 minutes, the upstairs will go below freezing in 3 hours. Then we will sleep downstairs. Mother, the chimney will not draw in this wind. I have been watching the smoke. It is coming back into the parlor. Mrs. Goodale stood up out of her rocking chair. She walked to the parlor stove. The smoke was coming back in slow, soft gray breaths around the seal of the firebox door. The room smelled of creosote. Then we will open the parlor window an inch. Mother, it is 60 miles an hour out there. An inch, Cornelius. By 11, on the night of the 30th, the parlor window had been opened an inch, and the wind had taken the inch and torn the sash up to its full height and broken the glass against the upper jamb, and the parlor was full of snow, and Cornelius was nailing a horse blanket over the open window with the heel of a boot and a handful of carpet tacks. Mrs. Goodale was in the kitchen. Miss Adela Strickland was upstairs in the small back bedroom that had been Eulalie's and Thomas's, sitting on the bed in her traveling cape with her teeth chattering, looking at the place on the floorboards where Mrs. Goodale had told her 2 days before. My son tapped this knot with the toe of his boot every time he came in from the barn, so they say. By the dawn of the 31st, the parlor stove had gone out. By noon, the kitchen stove had gone out. By the afternoon, Cornelius and Mrs. Goodale and Miss Adela were in the kitchen, all three, wearing every garment they owned, with the stove relit on the last of the pine, with the kitchen door wedged shut by a chair, and with the wind making a sound in the chimney like a woman crying very far away. Miss Adela was crying too. She was crying without sound, the way a girl raised in a polite Cheyenne house cries into a folded handkerchief with her shoulders very still. Cornelius was looking at his mother. Mrs. Goodale was looking at the kitchen window. The kitchen window faced south, toward the road, toward the rise that went down to the creek, and the cliff that none of them knew was there. Cornelius, Mrs. Goodale said, in the voice she used for matters that had been settled, ride into town, bring back a load of pine from Mr. Plummer. Mother, the road is gone. Cornelius Goodale, 34 years old, railroad clerk, bachelor of 6 years standing in Cheyenne, and now 3 days a husband, looked at his mother and saw, perhaps for the first time in his life, what his mother was. He went out to the barn. He saddled the brown mare. He came back to the kitchen door. He said, Mother, if I do not come back, you will at least know I tried. He rode out at 2:30 on the afternoon of the 31st of October into a 30-mile wind out of the north and snow blowing horizontal off the prairie. The brown mare went in up to her hocks at the gate. She went in up to her chest at the bend in the road. Cornelius dismounted to lead her. 1/2 mile from the Goodale gate, at the place where the road ran past the lone bur oak that the homesteaders called the hanging tree. Although nobody had ever been hanged on it, Cornelius Goodale stopped to rest. He put his back against the trunk of the bur oak. He put his arms around the brown mare's neck. He shut his eyes for a moment, just to gather himself for the next mile. He did not open his eyes again. The brown mare stood with him for 2 hours. Then she pulled her head out from under his arm and walked back the 1/2 mile to the Goodale barn. Mrs. Goodale found her at the gate at 5 o'clock. The saddle was empty. The reins were dragging. Mrs. Goodale stood at the gate. The wind took her plain black bonnet off her head and carried it across the pasture. She did not run after the bonnet. She stood at the gate. She put her hand on the brown mare's wet neck. She said one word. She said, Cornelius. The body of Cornelius Goodale was found on the morning of the 2nd of November by Deputy Gideon Raysmith and Mr. Plummer's hired man, frozen against the trunk of the bur oak, with his arm still in the position of having held a horse's neck. He was 26 hours dead. They brought him into Ironwood Crossing on a plank. They laid him in the back of Mr. Plummer's general store, where the store's coal stove had kept the back room above freezing through the storm. Mrs. Goodale walked into the back room at noon. She looked at her son. She did not weep. She had not wept for the husband, and she had not wept for Thomas, and she did not weep now. She said to Deputy Raysmith, who was standing by the back door with his hat in his hands, "Where is the girl?" "Ma'am," the deputy said. "Where is the girl, deputy?" "Mrs. Goodale, I do not know where the girl is." "You saw her go." The deputy did not answer that. He had not told her, and would not tell her, that he had sat his bay at the bend in the road on the 14th of October and watched her come down off the porch with the bundle and the dog and turn south. "You saw her go, deputy." "The 14th, Mr. Plummer told me. He said a hand had told him a deputy was on the road that afternoon and saw the whole of it." "I saw her go, ma'am." "Where did she go?" "South, ma'am." "South where?" "South, Mrs. Goodale, down the Ironwood Creek Road, toward the cliff country." Mrs. Goodale's hard, pale blue eyes did not move. They were looking at the deputy's silver star. "Deputy, I want her brought back." The deputy put his hat on. He looked at Mrs. Honora Goodale, 62 years old, in her black wool day dress, in the back room of Mr. Plummer's general store, with her dead son on a plank between them, and his kind gray eyes did the thing they had learned to do over 11 years of frontier service, which was to go very flat and look at her without looking at her. And here is the second turning of Deputy Gideon Raysmith, the one he himself was conscious of, the one he would carry. He did not soften his voice. He did not let his face do the thing a face does when it is sorry for you. He gave her the news the way he had given the eviction in his journal. He gave it in one line, flat, with no underline. "Mrs. Goodale," he said, "I do not believe she is alive to be brought back." The country south of the creek had 4 foot of snow on the level Tuesday morning. A woman walking out on the 14th with a bundle and a dog has been out of doors 21 nights. She is not alive, ma'am. If I find her, I will bring back what is left of her. That is the most I can promise. Mrs. Goodale stood with her hand on the edge of the plank. The pinched mouth worked once. She said, "Then bring back what is left of her, deputy, and bring back her dog. The dog was my son's." "Yes, ma'am." She walked out of the back room of Mr. Plummer's general store. She walked up the muddy main street of Ironwood Crossing in her black wool day dress with her gray hair uncovered because the wind had taken her bonnet 2 days ago and she had not got another. Mr. Plummer watched her from the window of the store. Mrs. Letitia Croft watched her from the porch of the church. Deputy Gideon Raysmith stood in the back room with his hat in his hands and his face flat and his journal in his coat pocket, and he did not yet know it, but his life had started turning. The Ironwood Crossing Sentinel came out on the Friday following. Its lead paragraph, set in 12-point Caslon by the editor Mr. Aldous Fernay, read, "On Saturday last, the storm of the 30th claimed Mr. Cornelius Goodale of the Goodale Farm, found frozen at the bur oak by a search party of 2 on Monday morning. We are also informed by reliable sources that Mr. Goodale's sister-in-law, Mrs. Eulalie Goodale, widow of the late Mr. Thomas Goodale, was turned out of the Goodale house on the 14th ult. and is feared to have perished on the open prairie. The Sentinel asks any reader having information of her movements after that date to please call at this office. 2 readers called. The first was Mrs. Letitia Croft, who said, "I saw her walk south past the church at 3 of the afternoon. The dog was at her left knee. She did not look at the church. She did not stop." The second was Mr. Ezra Plummer, who closed the door of his back office and said, in a low voice the editor had to lean forward to catch, "Mr. Fernie, I will tell you what I will tell you. She came to my back door on the 17th. I gave her cornmeal and bacon. She went south. I have not seen her since. I have wondered every day. If she is alive, she is somewhere south of the creek, and I will tell you a thing. That woman has a back to scrub a floor with that I have not seen in this town in 20 years. Mr. Fernie printed the Croft account. He did not print the Plummer account because Mr. Plummer asked him not to. Mr. Plummer did not say why. The town read the Sentinel that Friday afternoon, and on a Friday evening the town began to come around in its mind to the thing the town had not let itself think for 3 weeks. The town had known on the 15th of October that the old Goodale woman had turned the young Goodale woman out. The town had known it in the way a town in 1885 knew everything in a single morning, by way of Mrs. Letitia Croft and Mr. Plummer and the Friday stage driver, all 3 of whom had eyes, and none of whom had asked a question. The town had not approved of the turning out. The town had also not interfered, because the town was a frontier town in 1885, and the law of a frontier town in 1885 was that what a woman did with her own deedless property was her own business, and that what a daughter-in-law did when she was turned out was the daughter-in-law's business, and that the church would say a prayer, and the general store would slip a sack of cornmeal under the back door, and the deputy would write a line in his journal, and that was all the help anybody was going to give. But on the Friday of the 2nd week of November, with Cornelius Goodale laid out in the back of Mr. Plummer's general store, and Mrs. Adela Goodale, 22 years old and 3 days a wife, and now a widow, sitting in Mrs. Letitia Croft's parsonage parlor with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of broth she could not drink, and with old Mrs. Honora Goodale alone in the clapboard farmhouse with no chimney that drew and no woodpile to speak of, and a brown mare that would not let her into the stall. On that Friday, the town began to feel ashamed of itself. The shame was a slow thing. It was Mr. Plummer, on the Saturday morning, looking at the empty chair at the back of his general store, where Eulalie had scrubbed his floor on 5 Tuesdays running, and saying to himself, I should have asked her where she was going. I am a coward, Ezra Plummer, and I have been a coward for 68 years. It was Mrs. Letitia Croft, sitting up in bed at 3 in the morning of the Sunday, saying to her husband, the Reverend Mr. Croft, I watched her walk past the church. I did not call out. I did not run after her. I am a Christian woman, and I have failed a Christian charity. It was the editor, Mr. Fernie, holding the type for the next week's Sentinel, and looking at the page where the next paragraph was to go, and writing in his own hand, in 12-point Caslon, the headline, The Town Failed Her, and then setting it aside, because he was a small-town editor, and he did not yet have the courage of his own headline. But he kept the slug of type in the drawer for the next week, and the next, and the week after. It was Deputy Gideon Raysmith, in the back room of the deputy's office above Mr. Plummer's general store, on the night of the Sunday after the storm, taking down the leather-bound Territorial Journal and reading the line he had written on the 14th of October. Goodale widow turned out by mother-in-law. walking south with a dog, no interv. And reading it 3 times, and putting his thumb against the no interv, and pressing on the words until the ink smudged a little under the heat of his thumb, and saying aloud, in the empty room, in the voice he had used on Mrs. Goodale in Mr. Plummer's back room, flat and unhurried, "Gideon, you are a damned fool." He did not know yet that she was alive. He did not yet have any reason to believe she was. He pressed his thumb against the words because he had failed, and he knew he had failed, and the failure was no smaller for the fact that the law had not required him to do otherwise. He went out to the cliff country on the morning of the 8th of November, 6 days after the body of Cornelius was found. He went on the bay gelding, with snowshoes on his saddlebags and a tin of biscuits and a folded oilcloth and an extra wool blanket and his service revolver and the bay's feed in a canvas bag. He told Mr. Plummer that he was going. He told Mrs. Letitia Croft that he was going. He did not tell Mrs. Honora Goodale that he was going, because Mrs. Goodale had stopped speaking to anyone in Ironwood Crossing on the morning of Cornelius's funeral, and was sitting in the front parlor of the Clapboard farmhouse in her black wool dress with the parlor stove dead and the temperature in the parlor at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. And the only person who would go to the house at all was Mrs. Letitia Croft, who took her broth twice a day in a tin pail with a lid. The deputy went south on the Ironwood Creek Road. The road was a track in 4 feet of snow. The bay broke trail. He covered 3 miles in 5 hours. At the bend where Cornelius had died at the Bur Oak, he stopped and took off his hat and stood in the snow for a full minute with his head bare and the wind off the prairie taking his sandy hair across his eyes. And then he put the hat back on and went on. He did not find anything south of the Bur Oak. He went a 4th mile. He went a 5th. At the rise where the road dipped down toward the creek, in the long blue shadow of 3 in the afternoon, Deputy Gideon Raysmith stopped his bay and looked down at the creek bottom. And at first he did not see anything but a smooth white sheet of snow and the bent black lines of the cottonwoods. And then he saw, against the pale north face of the limestone cliff 60 feet up, a thing that did not belong on a 60-foot limestone cliff in November, in a country with no man living south of Ironwood Creek. He saw a thin curl of gray wood smoke. It was rising out of a vertical fissure in the cliff face. It was rising thin and steady against the pale blue afternoon sky. It was the smoke of a careful small fire kept going by a careful pair of hands. It was rising in the way that smoke rises only when somebody is alive on the other end of it. Deputy Raysmith sat his bay on the rise for 30 seconds. He did not move. He did not breathe. He watched the smoke. The smoke went on rising. He swore once, very softly, into the wind. He said, "By God." He came down off the rise and across the creek meadow on the bay, and where the snow drifted too deep for the horse, he dismounted and put on the snowshoes and led the bay by the rein. The cliff came up out of the prairie in front of him like a turned page. He walked the foot of the cliff for 100 yards, and at the place where the cliff face fell back into the inward curve of the alcove, he stopped, and he saw the thing that he was, in 11 years of frontier service, least prepared to see. He saw a wall of fitted limestone slabs, chinked with mud and dry buffalo grass, set into the mouth of a natural alcove in the base of the cliff. He saw a hand-cut cottonwood plank door hung on iron pins with a small green-tinted bottle glass window the size of a pie plate to the right of it. He saw the thin curl of smoke from the chimney above. He saw, in the snow at the foot of the door, a single set of small boot prints and a set of dog tracks, both fresh that morning. He saw, lashed to the iron hook on the outside of the door, a willow drying rack with 3 strips of dark-cured rabbit meat hanging from it. He stood in the snow at the foot of the door. He took off his hat. He held the hat in both hands. He said, in a voice he could not steady, "Mrs. Goodale, Mrs. Eulalie Goodale, it is Deputy Raysmith from Ironwood Crossing." There was a long silence inside the door. Then there was the soft scrape of an iron hook lifting out of a stone-cut socket. The door swung inward, slow, on its iron pins. The warm yellow light of a hearth fire and a hand-built stove came out of the doorway into the snow at the deputy's boots. There was a smell of wood smoke and bulberry jam and dried meat and clean wool and dog. In the doorway stood a young woman in a faded blue-gray wool dress and a cream linen apron and a heavy charcoal shawl, with honey-brown hair pinned up under a faded white linen bonnet that had been mended at the brim with black thread. And at her left knee stood a brown, medium-build, mixed-breed dog with a wide white blaze on his chest. And behind her, on the back wall of a small, chipped-out limestone chamber, there hung a drying rack of rope-lashed willow withies with 11 strips of cured meat, and a hearth shelf of stone with a tintype and a lithograph upon it, and an iron stove with a glowing firebox, and a stone and clay chimney rising up the back wall into a fissure that took the smoke to the upper world. Deputy Raysmith looked at her. She looked at him. "Mrs. Goodale," he said. He could not say anything else. Eulalie Goodale, 25 years old, 25 days alive in a limestone alcove south of Ironwood Creek, looked at the deputy on her doorstep with his hat in his hands. She did not throw herself at him. She did not weep. She did not say, "Thank God you have come." She did the third turning of her, the one nobody who knew her would ever have predicted, the one she did not know herself she was going to do until the moment her tongue moved. She said, "Deputy Raysmith, before you say anything else, tell my mother-in-law I do not want her to come." The deputy's mouth opened. Nothing came out of it. He closed it. "Tell her I am alive," Eulalie said, "and tell her I am well, and tell her I am here and that I am not coming back, and tell her I do not want her at this door, not in a wagon, not on foot, not on a stretcher, not in a coffin. Tell her that, deputy. Will you tell her that for me?" "Mrs. Goodale," the deputy said. His voice was rough. "Mrs. Goodale, Cornelius Goodale is dead. The storm of the 30th took him at the Bur Oak. He was riding to town for wood." Eulalie's pale gray eyes moved once. She put her hand on the door frame. The dog pressed against her knee. She said, after a moment, "I'm sorry to hear that, deputy. He was a kind boy when we were small. I had not seen him since the wedding." "Yes, ma'am." "And Mrs. Goodale herself?" "Alive, ma'am. In the house. She has not spoken since the funeral." "And the new wife?" "Mrs. Adela Goodale, 22 years old, 3 days a wife. She is at the parsonage with Mrs. Croft." Eulalie nodded slowly. She looked past the deputy at the white prairie behind him, and at the bent black cottonwoods at the creek, and at the bay gelding standing in the drift with his head down. And then she looked back at the deputy, and she said, in a voice that had the small, living warmth of the stove behind her in it, "You had better come in, Deputy Raysmith. Tie your horse to the willow, bring his feed. The kettle is hot." The deputy tied the bay to the willow at the corner of the alcove, with the wool blanket over his back. He carried the canvas feed bag into the doorway. He took off his hat. He stooped under the 4-foot ceiling of the doorway. He came inside. The chamber was 8 feet deep and 12 feet across the front, and a little under 6 feet to the underside of the limestone roof at the back. There was a sleeping shelf of fitted stone along the west wall, piled with prairie grass and willow withies, and covered with a sheet of waxed canvas and a heavy charcoal shawl. There was a hearth shelf along the east wall with the iron skillet and the tin cup and the tin plate and the horn spoon and the small tin type of a young man and a small lithograph of a small boy. There was the Acme No. 2 stove, glowing yellow in its firebox at the back wall. There was a stone and clay chimney rising into a fissure. There was a small green coin of late afternoon light coming through the bottle glass window onto the sand floor. There was a hand-built table the size of a Bible, 3 flat slabs of limestone set on 2 stacked stone pedestals, drawn up to the side of the bed shelf, and on the table was a tin cup, and beside the tin cup was a sprig of dried sage in a horn cup, and behind the table was a low limestone seat that Eulalie had cut out of the back wall on the 17th of October with the hand pick, the way her grandfather had cut a seat out of the back wall of his Pennsylvania root cellar when she was a child of 6. Eulalie poured the deputy a tin cup of hot water from the kettle on the stove. She put a teaspoon of the dark sour bullberry jam into the cup and stirred it with the horn spoon. She set the cup on the limestone table. She sat down on the bed shelf. She gestured for him to sit on the limestone seat. The dog came and laid his chin across the deputy's left boot and shut his eyes. The deputy sat down at the limestone table. He put his hands around the tin cup. He looked at the cup. He looked at the lithograph of the small boy in the black sailor jacket on the hearth shelf. He looked at Eulalie. He looked at his hands. And here's the third turning of Deputy Gideon Raysmith, the one he did not see coming and could not have prevented if he had. He sat down at the hand-built limestone table of a woman he had ridden past on the road on the 14th of October without lifting a hand, and he put his face into his hands, and he wept. He wept without sound for the first half-minute, and he wept with sound for the second half-minute, and he was shaking, and he could not stop shaking, and the dog looked up at him once and laid his chin back down across his boot and shut his eyes again, because the dog had decided at some point in the past 3 weeks that no man whose boot the dog had laid his chin on was going to come to harm in this room. The deputy wept for 4 full minutes. He had not wept once in 11 years of frontier service. He had not wept at the bur oak when they cut Cornelius down off the trunk. He had not wept at the funeral. He had not wept at the journal entry of the 14th of October. He wept now because a woman he had failed had given him a tin cup of hot water with bullberry jam in it, and because the small living warmth of an Acme No. 2 from St. Louis, 1869, was at his back, and because a brown dog with a white blaze had laid a chin on his boot, and because the world, which his eyes had learned over 11 years not to look at directly, had been here all along, alive, in a limestone alcove 4 miles south of a town that had failed her and a deputy who had ridden past, and she had built it with her own hands, and she had not died. When he could speak, he said, "Mrs. Goodale, I am sorry." "For what, deputy?" "For the 14th. I sat my bay at the bend in the road. I watched her shut the door behind you. I rode on. I wrote in my journal that night that there had been no interve. I underlined the no interve. I rode on." "I know you did, deputy." You saw me?" "I saw you. You touched your hat brim. I was looking down. I saw the touch out of the corner of my eye. I have been a coward, Mrs. Goodale. You have been a deputy in a country that does not yet have a law for what was done to me, Deputy Ray Smith. That is not the same thing as a coward. It feels the same, ma'am. I expect it does. He drank the tin cup of hot water. He drank it slowly. The bullberry was so sour his eyes watered again, and Eulalie watched him cry the second time without saying anything, because she understood that the first weeping had been about her, and the second weeping was about himself, and a person is allowed both. He stayed at the cliff for 2 hours. She fed him a strip of dried marmot and a small piece of cornmeal mush from the skillet. He fed the bay from the canvas bag, leaning out the doorway with his hat off. He looked, with her permission, at her wall and her chimney and her drying rack and her snares set along the rabbit run in the cottonwoods. He said, twice, in a voice that had gone soft, "Mrs. Goodale, I have not seen the like of this in 11 years. Thank you, deputy. You did this with a handpick and a small axe, and a coil of rope, deputy, and a dog. And a dog." When the light began to go at the bottom of the cliff and the bay was rested, the deputy stood up to leave. He put on his hat. He stood in the doorway. He said, "Mrs. Goodale, I am going to go back to Ironwood Crossing. I am going to tell Mr. Plummer you are alive. I am going to tell Mrs. Letitia Croft you are alive. I am going to tell the editor of the Sentinel. And I am going to tell Mrs. Honora Goodale you are alive, and that you do not want her to come. I will say it in your words. I will not soften them. Thank you, deputy. And I will come back, Mrs. Goodale, with your permission, once a week, if the snow lets a man through, with Mr. Plummer's bacon ends and a sack of cornmeal, and the Sentinel, if you would like the Sentinel." "I would like the Sentinel, deputy. Thank you." "Mrs. Goodale." "Yes, deputy. What you have done here, I will not forget it as long as I live. Deputy Ray Smith, neither will I." He rode back to Ironwood Crossing in the blue dusk of the 8th of November. He went first to Mr. Plummer's general store, because Mr. Plummer was the man who had given her the cornmeal. Mr. Plummer was sweeping the boards in the lamplight. The deputy got off the bay. He took off his hat. He said, "Mr. Plummer." "Deputy, she is alive." Mr. Ezra Plummer, 68, widower of 79, set the broom against the wall. He put his hand against the side of his face. He said, "Praise be. She has built a stone wall and a chimney into the cliff at the bend. She has a stove. She has a door. She has dried meat for the winter. She has the dog. Praise be, deputy. Praise be. Mr. Plummer, she does not want her mother-in-law to come." Mr. Plummer was quiet. Then he said, "I will tell the old woman myself, deputy, if you would like. I have a thing or two to say to Mrs. Goodale that I have been saving up." "Thank you, Mr. Plummer, but she said she wanted me." "Of course she did, deputy." Mr. Aldous Fernie of the Sentinel was the next stop. The deputy stood in the print shop with his hat in his hands and gave Mr. Fernie the news in 3 sentences, and Mr. Fernie sat down on his composing stool with a hand over his mouth, and after a moment he said, "Deputy, with your leave, I am going to set that headline I have had in my drawer." "Set it, Mr. Fernie." "And I am going to set under it, in 14-point bold, 'She lives. She built a house of stone.'" "Set it, sir." The Reverend Croft and Mrs. Letitia Croft were the third. Mrs. Croft, when she heard, sat down on her parlor settee with her hands folded in her lap and wept for 10 minutes without sound. The Reverend Croft put his hand on his wife's shoulder. He did not weep. He said, "Letitia, we will go to Mrs. Goodale together. The deputy will come with us. There are things to be said." "There are, Mr. Croft." The four of them, the deputy, the Reverend Croft, Mrs. Letitia Croft, and Mr. Plummer, walked out together to the Goodale farmhouse at 7:30 on the evening of the 8th of November, in the cold blue dusk, with a single oil lamp between them. They knocked. There was no answer. They knocked again. The Reverend tried the door. The door opened. The parlor was at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire was out. Mrs. Honora Goodale was sitting in her rocking chair in her black wool day dress with her gray hair down around her shoulders for the first time in 20 years. The brown mare was in the open kitchen doorway behind her, having walked into the house out of the cold in the afternoon when nobody had stopped her. Mrs. Adela Goodale was nowhere to be seen. She had been moved to the parsonage that morning by Mrs. Croft, where she would in due course go back to her parents in Cheyenne by the spring stage and live out her life as a respectable Cheyenne widow, twice widowed in 8 months, the second time by association. Mrs. Honora Goodale looked up at the four of them in her parlor. Her hard pale blue eyes had gone the color of skim milk left out in the cold. She said, "Cornelius." "Mrs. Goodale," the deputy said. "Mrs. Goodale, I have come with news of your daughter-in-law." "I have no daughter-in-law, deputy." "You have, ma'am. She is alive. She is 4 miles south of here in the cliff country. She has built herself a house of stone. She has a stove. She has dried meat for the winter. She has the dog." Mrs. Goodale's mouth worked once. The mouth was very pale. "She is alive." "Yes, ma'am. And you have seen her." "This afternoon, ma'am. And she has sent me a message." "She has, ma'am." "What is her message, deputy?" The deputy stood at the parlor door with his hat in his hands. The Reverend Croft and Mrs. Croft and Mr. Plummer stood behind him. The brown mare in the kitchen doorway stamped her near hind once on the pine floorboards over the knot Thomas Goodale used to tap with the toe of his boot, and the knot did not answer. Deputy Gideon Raysmith said, in a voice that was flat and even and not unkind and not soft, "Mrs. Goodale, her message is this: she is alive, she is well, she is at the cliff, and she is not coming back. She does not want you to come to her door. Not in a wagon, not on foot, not on a stretcher, not in a coffin. Those are her words, Mrs. Goodale. She asked me to give them to you in her words." Mrs. Honora Goodale sat in her rocking chair in the cold parlor with her gray hair down around her shoulders. She did not move for a long time. Then she put her hand against her own mouth, and she shut her eyes, and one tear, only one, came out of the corner of the right eye and ran down the dry, weathered skin of her cheek, and she said, very quiet, very small, the way a woman speaks when she has used up her bigger voice 40 years ago, "I see." She did not say anything else that night. She did not say anything else for a week. She did not ever, in the remaining 4 years and 7 months of her life, speak the name Eulalie aloud. She lived alone in the clapboard farmhouse, with Mrs. Letitia Croft bringing her broth in the morning, and the Reverend reading to her from Job in the evening. And she died in the spring of 1890 of an old woman's pneumonia, in the front parlor, in the rocking chair, with the brown mare's halter laid across her lap, because the brown mare had died the winter before her. She was buried beside her son Thomas in the small Methodist churchyard in Ironwood Crossing. The headstone was paid for by Mr. Plummer. The funeral was attended by the Reverend Mrs. Croft, Mr. Plummer, Deputy Raysmith, and Mr. Aldous Fernie of the Sentinel. It was not attended by Eulalie Goodale. The winter at the cliff went past as winters do. The deputy came every Wednesday, snow allowing, with a saddlebag of bacon ends and cornmeal and a folded copy of the Sentinel, and after the third visit, a small parcel of seed potatoes from Mr. Plummer for the spring. They sat at the limestone table. They drank hot water with bullberry jam in tin cups. They did not say very much. They did not need to. The dog laid his chin across the deputy's left boot every visit. The fire ticked. The chimney drew clean. The bullberry was sour. The bay gelding waited at the willow. In December, the Sentinel ran a long piece by Mr. Aldous Fernie under the headline, "The Woman at the Cliff," in which Mr. Fernie described with permission the wall and the chimney and the door and the drying rack and the limestone table and the small green coin of light through the bottle-glass window, and which ended with a paragraph that the town would clip out and pin to walls and kitchens for the next 40 years. She was turned out by a roof that was never hers. She was failed by a town that watched her go. She was ridden past by a deputy who had eyes. She built, with her own 2 hands, a hearth in a cliff that had no hearth, and she lived through the storm of the 30th that took 2 men on the open prairie. The town of Ironwood Crossing owes her an apology that the town does not yet know how to make. We will, with your leave, Mrs. Goodale, begin to learn. She read the piece by the firebox of the Acme No. 2. On the Wednesday, the deputy brought it. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it inside Thomas's Bible against the back board where she had penciled the sentence about the lithograph. She said to the deputy, "Mr. Fernie is a kind man, deputy." "He is, ma'am. You may tell him I have read it. You may tell him I have nothing to add." "Yes, ma'am." The spring came on the 11th of April, 1886, in the way Wyoming Territory spring comes, which is to say all at once, with the meltwater roaring in the creek bottom, and the cottonwoods coming out in soft green pollen, and the bluebirds back at the cliff face by the second week. Eulalie planted Mr. Plummer's seed potatoes in a small plot she had cleared with the small axe at the south foot of the cliff. She set a willow weir in the creek for the cutthroat trout. She let down the drying rack and washed the canvas in the creek and laid it in the sun. She did not that spring leave the cliff for the town. The town came to her. Mrs. Letitia Croft and the Reverend on a Sunday in May, bringing a basket of new bread. Mr. Plummer on a Tuesday in June with a sack of laying hen feed and the news that he had a Rhode Island Red in the back of his store wanting a country home. Mr. Aldous Fernie on a Saturday in July with a bound copy of the Sentinel for the past year. Deputy Gideon Raysmith on Wednesdays. Always Wednesdays. He never missed. If you have ever been turned out of a house that was never going to be yours anyway, subscribe to Frozen Homestead Tales. We tell these stories because some women only become themselves when the door closes behind them. In the spring of 1887, Eulalie Goodale and Deputy Gideon Raysmith were married in the small white Methodist church in Ironwood Crossing by the Reverend Mr. Croft, with Mrs. Letitia Croft and Mr. Ezra Plummer and Mr. Aldous Fernie in attendance, and Birch the brown dog sitting in the center aisle in a clean linen kerchief tied around his neck. They did not move to a clapboard house in town. They moved together to the cliff, and they enlarged the alcove with the hand pick over the next 4 summers, and they raised 3 children in it, a boy named Thomas, a girl named Honora, and a girl named Letitia. And the cliff house at the bend of Ironwood Creek stood in continuous occupation by Goodale Raysmiths and their descendants until the spring of 1971, when the great-granddaughter of Eulalie sold it to the Wyoming State Historical Society, who put a small bronze plaque at the foot of the door that read, in raised letters, "The Eulalie Goodale Cliff House, built by one woman and a dog in the autumn of 1885. The Bible with the penciled sentence in the backboard is in a glass case in the Cheyenne Frontier Museum. The lithograph of the small boy in the black sailor jacket is in the case beside it. The tintype of the young man in the Sunday coat is in the case beside that. The small, short-handled axe and the hand pick are mounted on the wall above. The Acme No. 2, St. Louis, 1869, still stands in the back of the alcove, on the same flat course of stones the prospector laid in 1872, and visitors are permitted to put a hand on the cold iron and feel, very faint under the palm, the texture of the foundry mark. On the morning Eulalie and Gideon were married, before the wedding, before the Reverend rose, before Mr. Plummer came in his Sunday coat, Eulalie walked alone with the dog out to the cliff at dawn and stood at the foot of the door of her own house and looked up at the chimney. A thin curl of gray wood smoke was rising out of the vertical fissure in the cliff face. It rose thin and steady against a pale spring sky the color of a robin's egg. It went up and up. It found the wind. It bent. It went on east toward the country she had never seen and would, in time, with her 3 children and her good husband and her old brown dog, learn. The smoke against the pale spring blue